The night shift badge clipped to Margaret Walsh's scrubs caught the harsh fluorescent glow as she pushed through the ICU doors at Mercy General. 11:47 p.m. Her hands were steady as she scanned the unit for beds occupied, 2 monitors humming their familiar rhythm, the ventilator in Bay 2 wheezed like an old accordion. She'd done this for 3 years now, the graveyard shift, the hours when most people slept, and she moved like a ghost through the corridors of Denver's most demanding hospital. Nobody here knew anything about her. Not the scars tissue thin on her knuckles. Not the way her eyes assessed trauma patients with the cold precision of someone who'd seen worse. Not the pair of worn combat boots locked in the bottom of her locker, the leather creased and salt-stained from places most people would never name out loud. She touched those boots once per shift, every shift, the ritual as automatic as breathing. Tonight she paused at her locker, palm flat against the cold metal, before turning the lock and heading to the station. Senior night charge nurse Chen was waiting with the handoff report, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who'd been awake for 20 hours. Margaret listened without taking notes. She didn't need to write anything down. Her memory was a weapon. 12 years of combat medicine in Marjah had taught her that details meant the difference between living and dying, and old habits didn't fade just because you'd hung up your uniform and put on scrubs instead. The ventilator settings on Bay 2 would stick with her. The allergy profile on Bay 3, penicillin, sulfur drugs, would be there when she needed it. The slow decline of Mr. Patterson's renal function would be something she'd track without being asked. Quiet night so far, Chen said, which was hospital speak for something's about to arrive. Margaret had learned that language years ago, just in a different context. Quiet meant the calm before. Quiet meant prepare. 1 admission expected around midnight. Transfer from community hospital. 8-year-old girl, possible CNS infection, they've been running diagnostics all day. Chen's jaw tightened. She didn't say it, but Margaret heard it underneath. This was a hard case. A child was never easy. Bay 4's prepped. Let me know if you need anything. Margaret nodded, watching Chen gather her things and head for the elevator. The unit settled into its night rhythm. The machines beeped their steady commentary. Rain started hammering the windows, not the soft kind, but the kind that sounded like applause, like the sky was angry. She was checking for sights on Bay 1 when the ambulance alert came through overhead. The voice was clipped, professional. Incoming pediatric, multiple seizures en route, ETA for minutes. The kind of alert that made nurses move faster without thinking about it. She was at the unit doors when they wheeled the stretcher through, and the moment she saw the little girl's face, small, pale, dark hair matted against her skull, something in Margaret's chest stopped. The child was seizing, her small body rigid against the transport mattress, her lips pale blue. The paramedics were narrating vitals that sounded like a downward spiral: blood pressure 92/58, heart rate 138, oxygen saturation 84%. The father was moving with them, his face the color of concrete, his shoulders broad enough that he had to duck through the doorway, the brass insignia on his uniform catching the light. Colonel's rank. Delta Force patch on his sleeve. She didn't recognize him. Not at first. The memory was too old, locked in a compartment of her mind marked "Do Not Open," and she had been very good at not opening it for 20 years. But something about the set of his shoulders, the way he moved like someone accustomed to command even in the absolute helplessness of watching his child seize, made her freeze in the doorway for exactly 1 second. 1 second was all it took. She saw his hand reach for his daughter's arm, protective, unable to help, and Margaret's hands remembered something her brain was trying to forget. Bay 4, she heard herself say, her voice the careful neutral of night shift nursing, nothing underneath it but professionalism. The team swept past her into the bay, 2 pediatric nurses already there, the equipment ready, the crash cart positioned at the doorway. Margaret followed, her mind compartmentalizing. The father was background, the machines were foreground, the patient was everything. Small child, 8 years old according to the paramedic report, name Lily, onset of seizure activity 3 days ago, fever pattern escalating. The transfer summary came through on the monitor as the pediatric team made contact with the child: autoimmune encephalitis, presumed diagnosis, brain imaging consistent, multiple anticonvulsant trials already failed, treatment recommendations from the referring hospital leaning toward comfort care. Comfort care. A clinical euphemism for stopping fighting. Dr. Hargrove arrived at the bay doors before Margaret could finish reading the notes. He was a tall man with a kind of posture that suggested he'd never doubted anything in his life, his white coat tailored at a cost that probably exceeded Margaret's monthly mortgage, his silver hair the kind that came from genetics and expensive haircuts. He didn't look at the child first. He looked at the monitors, then at the vital signs, then at the folder one of the nurses was already holding out for him. His expression shifted into something sympathetic, the mask that doctors wore when they were about to deliver bad news wrapped in gentle language. "Let's get a full panel drawn immediately," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people move without questioning. "Comprehensive metabolic, CBC, lactate, blood cultures. I want imaging reviewed, that CT scan from Community General." He took the folder, scanning the images on the computer monitor with the speed of someone who'd made thousands of these assessments. His expression didn't change. No evidence of hemorrhage. Inflammation is consistent with viral encephalitis or autoimmune process. "We'll need an LP once she's stable," but in terms of treatment, he turned to face the colonel, and his voice shifted into something slower, more measured, the tone reserved for family members who needed to understand that hope was, in fact, a dangerous thing. "Colonel Graves, I'm Dr. Hargrove, Chief of Neurology. Can we speak in my office for a moment?" Margaret watched the colonel's face, the tightening around his eyes, the way his hands clenched and then forced themselves open. He was built like someone who solved problems with direct action, and he had just discovered there was no problem to solve, only an outcome to accept. That was how these conversations always went. People like the colonel, people used to command and control and the absolute certainty that their orders would be executed, they arrived at hospitals expecting that same certainty. They expected that money or rank or sheer force of will could change the trajectory of a virus attacking their child's brain. They learned differently. "Sir," Margaret said quietly. She was checking me for line, making sure the anticonvulsants were flowing, her hands moving with the kind of automatic competence that came from years of this work. "She's going to be okay for a moment. These medications are working. She's stable right now." She didn't address the colonel directly, that would be overstepping, and overstepping was how night shift nurses became invisible in the morning. But she said it loud enough that both men heard it, and she made sure her voice carried the kind of certainty that comes from someone who actually knew what she was talking about. Hargrove didn't acknowledge her. He simply gestured toward his office with the kind of implicit command that meant the colonel should follow. Margaret watched them go, then turned her full attention to the child on the bed. Lily was small for 8, her breathing shallow, her small hands clenching and unclenching. The seizure activity had stopped, the medication had worked, but her eyes were still unfocused, still trapped in whatever neurological storm was raging in her brain. "Hey, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, making a small adjustment to the oxygen delivery, checking the percentage, making sure Lily was getting everything she needed. "I've got you. You're safe. You're in a good hospital." She was saying the things that night shift nurses say to unconscious children, the things that don't matter but somehow matter anyway. Her eyes caught on the photograph pinned to the cork board at the foot of the bed, the colonel holding a newborn, both of them impossibly young, a field hospital with canvas walls barely visible in the background. That photograph was dated 20 years ago. That photograph was from Marjah, from the emergency medevac wing, from the 3 days that had changed Margaret's life in ways she had never quite recovered from. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when Hargrove emerged from his office 20 minutes later, his face arranged in that carefully composed expression of medical gravity. Margaret was hanging a second anticonvulsant, one that the transfer summary noted had already been tried, one that the records indicated had failed to prevent seizure activity. She didn't look at Hargrove directly, but she heard what he said to the attending nurse, a young resident named Dr. Patel who was looking at the chart with the kind of desperate hopefulness that came from not yet understanding that sometimes your best wasn't enough. "We're going to transition toward comfort care protocols," Hargrove said, his voice low but carrying through the bay anyway, designed to be heard but presented as confidential. The autoimmune encephalitis in this case appears to be treatment refractory. The child has already failed 2 medication regimens. At this point, aggressive interventions are likely only to extend suffering. I'll speak with the family about palliative support, but I think we need to be realistic about outcomes here. He placed a hand on Dr. Patel's shoulder, the gesture of a mentor guiding a junior colleague toward the harder truths of medicine. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is know when to stop fighting. Margaret's hands didn't stop moving. She continued adjusting the flow rate, continued monitoring the oxygen saturation climbing slowly back toward normal, 84% now, 86, still climbing. Her jaw clenched once, just once, a single moment where her composure rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Then it settled. She was very good at settling things. Very good at pushing things down, compartmentalizing, moving forward with the work in front of her. But in the back of her mind, underneath everything, she was already thinking about plasmapheresis. The removal and replacement of the plasma, filtering out the autoimmune antibodies attacking Lily's nervous system. The procedure that worked in treatment-resistant autoimmune encephalitis cases. The procedure that Hargrove had just suggested they weren't going to pursue because stopping was easier than fighting, and Hargrove was a man who had apparently learned that lesson already, learned it so well that he could teach it to others while an 8-year-old girl died of something treatable in a hospital that had the resources to treat it. Morning rounds began at 7:45 on day 3, the way they always did at Mercy General, residents trailing behind Dr. Hargrove like pilot fish behind a shark, their white coats starched into weapons, their clipboards clutched like shields. Margaret stood at the foot of Lily Graves' bed, her hand steady on the stand, her eyes on the monitor displaying numbers that told a story nobody else seemed willing to read. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, measured and relentless. Lily's small chest rose and fell with machine precision, her 8-year-old face slack with sedation, her dark hair matted against the pillow. Colonel Graves stood in the corner, the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change, even diminished by 72 hours of sleeplessness and helplessness. His dress uniform hung on him like a borrowed salute. The silver star on his chest caught the fluorescent light, and Margaret recognized it for what it was, a man accustomed to saving lives now forced to watch someone else's system fail to save his daughters. He'd been at Marjah too, though she'd never met him in the field. She knew because she remembered his face from a photograph he'd shown her once, 20 years ago, a photograph of a baby, wrapped in an emergency blanket during a medevac she'd orchestrated. That baby was now dying of something treatable, and the best neurologist in the hospital had apparently decided that fighting was less profitable than surrendering. Autoimmune encephalitis, likely anti-NMDA receptor, Hargrove announced, not to Lily but to his residents, performing medicine like a surgeon performing for an audience in the bleachers. The inflammation is extensive. Prognosis is poor. I've recommended we focus on comfort measures at this juncture. His fingers traced a gesture over Lily's chart without ever actually opening it. Margaret had watched him do this 3 times now, speak about Lily as if the child were already a case study, a learning opportunity, a line item to be processed and filed. The residents nodded, the way residents always do. One of them, a woman barely older than Margaret's own son, actually wrote down the words comfort measures as if they were wisdom instead of surrender. Margaret's jaw tightened. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. She could taste the bitter copper of her own restraint, that metallic flavor that came from 18 years of swallowing words that wanted to escape like prisoners from a cell. Margaret took one breath. Then another. Her voice emerged level, measured, the voice of someone who'd learned in places with names like Marjah and Jalabad that showing nothing was the greatest armor available. Dr. Hargrove, plasmapheresis protocols are indicated for anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. The literature supports. Hargrove turned toward her with the speed and precision of a weapon being aimed. His eyebrows rose in a pantomime of surprise so theatrical it was almost impressive. "I'm sorry, nurse." He glanced at her badge with exaggerated effort, squinting as if her name were written in a language he'd never encountered. "Walsh, is it? I didn't realize you'd completed a neurology residency since your last shift." He paused, let the silence settle like a blade. "Or are we now taking medical advice from career night shifters?" The residents laughed, the nervous laughter of subordinates unsure whether they were laughing with or being set up for slaughter. One of them, a man with soft hands that had probably never done anything harder than hold a pen, actually smiled as if he'd been given permission to enjoy something cruel. Colonel Graves' hand tightened on the bedrail. Margaret saw it, that microscopic tension, the way a soldier's body announces fury before his face is allowed to show it. She met Hargrove's eyes without flinching, without the heat rising to her cheeks that shame was supposed to bring. "I've read the literature, Doctor." Hargrove stepped closer, a violation of space that was intentional, that was meant to make her retreat. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire room, a murmur designed to be overheard, to be broadcast. "Reading is adorable. Practicing medicine requires judgment you don't possess. Stay in your lane, Nightingale." The last word was an insult wrapped in a word, a dismissal made poetic. Margaret took one measured breath. Her face remained absolutely still. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She didn't retreat to a supply closet to cry or press her back against a wall or any of the 1,000 small surrenders she could have made. Instead, she met Hargrove's eyes, held them, unflinching, without contempt and without pleading, and said nothing. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. Hargrove's smile faltered for exactly 1 second before reasserting itself, harder than before. He turned back to his residence. "As I was saying, comfort measures. Recommend speaking with palliative care by end of shift." He moved toward the next patient, his entourage trailing, and the room began to breathe again. The break room at 2 o'clock in the afternoon was where Mercy General's nurses came to remember they were human. It smelled of burnt coffee and old microwaved lunches, and the afternoon light came through the east windows at an angle that made everything look like a photograph of something that had already died. Margaret unwrapped her sandwich, turkey and mustard, no mayo, eaten mechanically every shift for 3 years, and sat at the corner table where she always sat, her back to the wall in a habit older than civilian nursing. For nurses occupied the main table near the window, Sarah Chen, Rebecca Morris, and 2 registry nurses whose names Margaret had heard called in passing. They were mid-conversation about something involving a neighbor and a fence dispute when Margaret entered. When they saw her, something shifted in the air, not dramatic, not theatrical, but real. Sarah Chen glanced at Rebecca Morris. Rebecca Morris gathered her yogurt and salad. One of the registry nurses stood up and carried her drink to the far table, the one by the supply closet. The other followed. Margaret unwrapped her sandwich with steady hands. She bit, she chewed, she swallowed. The bread tasted like cardboard. The turkey tasted like nothing. She kept her eyes on the table surface, watching a small water stain near the edge, noticing how the fluorescent light above her created a halo that made her own hand look like it belonged to someone else. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from sadness but from rage, from the futility of invisible strength, from knowing that you could survive Marjah and Kandahar and a dozen operations whose names were still classified, and still have no defense against the quiet cruelty of being simply left. She wiped it without looking up. She took another bite of her sandwich. Her hands remained steady. The bulletin board in the hallway outside the unit was made of cork, covered with mandatory staff notices and gratitude cards and a photograph of the staff holiday party from 6 months ago, Margaret visible in the back row, half out of frame, the way she preferred to exist. At 6:30 that evening, a new notice had been posted. It was printed on official disciplinary paper, the kind that went into personnel files, the kind that followed you from hospital to hospital until you became unhireable, until you became invisible even in the places you'd fought. Disciplinary notice. Employee name, M. Walsh. Date of incident, date. Category, insubordination, overstepping scope of practice. Description, employee engaged in unauthorized medical advice, directly contradicting physician orders and undermining physician authority in front of patients and family members. Demonstrated poor judgment and disregard for professional boundaries. Recommended action, formal written warning. Re-education on scope of nursing practice required before next shift assignment. Margaret stood before the board, her reflection visible in the protective plastic cover. She looked like a ghost of herself, like someone viewing her own crime scene photograph. Behind her, she could hear the evening shift gathering, the sound of conversation stopping, the sound of awareness spreading like ripples in still water. She reached up and removed the notice carefully, unfolding it once, then again, understanding as she did that Hargrove was watching from the nurse's station. She could feel his eyes on her back like the weight of a weapon. She folded the notice and placed it in her pocket. Then she turned to face him. They stood perhaps 40 feet apart, separated by the nurse's station and the weight of what had become impossible to ignore. Margaret locked her eyes on Hargrove's, and the change in her face was so complete that 3 residents actually stepped back. Her voice emerged low and level, the voice of someone who'd already survived things that killed other people. "I've watched better men than you send children to their graves to cover their mistakes." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked back to Lily's room, and Hargrove's satisfied expression had transformed into something that looked almost like fear. The room went so quiet you could hear the monitors beeping in isolation. Nobody moved. The thing Margaret had become in that moment was older than her, more dangerous than her, and for the first time in 72 hours, Hargrove understood that he'd made a tactical error. He'd pushed someone into a corner, and corners were where the most desperate people fought their hardest. Margaret spent that night at her kitchen table with her laptop glowing in the 3 a.m. darkness, her son asleep upstairs, the only sounds the occasional car passing on the street outside and the mechanical hum of the refrigerator in the next room. She pulled Lily's case file details from memory, anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, CSF findings, imaging results, and cross-referenced them against treatment protocols from journals, medical databases, institutional guidelines. The plasmapheresis rejection didn't make clinical sense. The procedure was standard for autoimmune encephalitis, standard of care, covered by insurance, relatively low risk. 5 successful case studies published in the last 18 months alone, all showing clinical improvement by the 3rd treatment cycle. So why had Hargrove recommended comfort care? Margaret pulled up his case files from the past 6 months. 23 neurology patients admitted under his care. She created a spreadsheet, insurance status, family income profile based on occupation listed in admissions paperwork, treatment recommendations, outcome. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in solution. Patients with Blue Cross, Senior, United Healthcare, the commercial insurance that paid well, received aggressive interventions. Experimental treatments. Multiple imaging studies. Referrals to a facility called Denver Neurological Imaging Solutions, located 3 blocks from the hospital. Patients with Medicaid, Medicare, or military TRICARE, the pairs Hargrove could dominate because they reimbursed slowly, received comfort care recommendations. Quick surrenders. No imaging referrals. She expanded her search. Denver Neurological Imaging Solutions. Ownership, Dr. James Hargrove and Associates LLC. One partner, a cardiologist named Dr. Michael Sterling. Sterling's spouse, Patricia Sterling, registered dietitian. Patricia Sterling's brother, Dr. David Hargrove, who currently served on the hospital's board of directors. Margaret's hands began to shake. Not from fear but from recognition. This was a pattern she'd seen before, in different uniforms, in different languages. This was the architecture of corruption, built not dramatically but incrementally, with reasonable steps that each seemed justified in isolation, until the structure you'd constructed could support the weight of someone's child dying while you counted the money her death would save. She took a breath. She screenshot everything. She felt the familiar sensation from Marjah beginning to spread through her nervous system, the clarity that came before action, the calm that came when you stopped hoping that someone else would fix the problem and accepted that you would have to do it yourself. Margaret arrived at Mercy General at 5:30 the next morning, before day shift, before anyone was watching. She accessed the patient records database using her credentials and pulled up Hargrove's referral patterns for the past 8 months. She documented them, the specific insurance codes, the specific patient names, the specific imaging facility locations. She created a file labeled SPIADSHET, something innocuous, something that wouldn't raise flags when the hospital's IT department reviewed her access logs later. Then she found Sarah Chen in the break room and asked the question that changed everything. Sarah, can I ask about the imaging referral protocols? Sarah's face went carefully blank. She was a good nurse, intelligent, aware. She was also a single mother with a daughter in private school and a mortgage in a city where housing had become a weapon against people like them. That's above nursing pay grade, Meg. Drop it. But if there's a pattern of... Drop it. Sarah's voice was urgent now, the urgent tone of someone doing you a favor by warning you. Hargrove has 3 board members in his pocket and the chief of medicine owes him his position. You're a night shift nurse with no allies. Drop it. Margaret walked away. She passed a supply closet, and through the cracked door, she heard Hargrove's voice on the phone. The Walsh problem is escalating. I need her references checked, find something I can use. Go back to the nursing agency. There's always something. The words landed like shrapnel. No allies. Night shift nurse. The invisibility she'd chosen as safety had become her liability. She'd entered civilian nursing through a barebone staffing agency that asked minimal questions, that required no military documentation, that existed specifically for people like her, people who wanted to disappear into a new identity. But that agency kept no substantial records. And Hargrove was right. There was always something, somewhere, if you looked hard enough. That evening, Margaret stood at Lily's bedside taking evening vitals. The child's oxygen saturation was 94% on the ventilator settings. Her blood pressure was 98/62, trending down. The fever had returned. The clinical deterioration was now accelerating toward the point where even the most aggressive intervention would fail. The window was closing, measured in hours, measured in the difference between a child who could be saved and a child who couldn't. Colonel Graves sat by the bedside, his massive frame somehow made smaller by exhaustion. Margaret checked the 4 line, and the words came out before she could stop them. Colonel, has anyone discussed plasmapheresis with you? He looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, rimmed with the particular redness that came from 3 days of not sleeping. Hargrove said it wouldn't work. That we're past that stage. Sir, with respect, that's not... Margaret's jaw tightened. Nurse Walsh. Hargrove's voice cut through from the doorway like a blade through silk. My office. Now. The words hung in the air like a sentence that had already been decided. His office door closed with a kind of finality that made the fluorescent light seem to buzz louder. Margaret sat across from his desk, or rather, stood, because Hargrove hadn't offered a chair. His fingers steepled under his chin, eyes sharp as a scalpel's edge. I've contacted the nursing agency that placed you, he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd never had to raise it. Interesting how little they actually know about your background. 3 years here at Mercy General, but almost nothing before that. No hospital references. No military service documentation. No verifiable employment history older than 90 days. Margaret's jaw tightened once. That was all. Her hands remained visible on the desktop, palms flat, betraying nothing. I've met all licensing requirements, she said. Her voice was level, measured, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago that silence was a more powerful weapon than protest. My credentials are current. My board certifications are valid. Of course they are. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He was a big man, soft in the way that wealth allowed, tailored shirts that didn't quite hide the thickness around his middle, a Rolex that cost more than Margaret's annual salary. But credentials aren't the issue here. Your pattern of behavior is. I've been reviewing your chart notations over the past 72 hours. Do you know what I found? A nurse making independent clinical observations. A nurse questioning attending physician judgment. A nurse, he paused, letting the words settle like stones into water, suggesting treatment protocols that fall well outside her scope of practice. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm, indifferent to what was happening in this small office on the administrative floor. Margaret could smell his cologne, something expensive and cloying, the scent of a man who believed he could purchase his way out of any consequence. She kept her breathing even. "I've observed a patient in acute neurological decline who may benefit from plasmapheresis," she said quietly. "The literature supports. The literature supports whatever I say it supports." His voice hadn't changed pitch, hadn't risen at all. That was what made it so dangerous. "I've contacted the State Board of Nursing. They're sending an investigator to review your record for autonomous practice violations. By end of week, you'll be suspended pending investigation. Your license will be flagged. No hospital in Colorado will touch you." He straightened a pen on his desk, the gesture almost delicate. "I've also contacted hospital board members regarding your employment status. Several of them have expressed concerns about safety protocols. Concerns I've carefully detailed in writing." Margaret's hands remained flat on the desk. She'd learned this in Marjah, in compounds where a single flinch could be read as weakness. Where the men across from you were looking for any sign that you were afraid. Her eyes met his, not challenging, not defiant, just present. "Unavoidable. Those board members," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "they owe you favors." For the first time, Hargrove's composure fractured. His jaw tightened. His right hand curled into a fist before he caught himself and relaxed it. "My professional relationships are my concern, not yours," he said, and now there was an edge underneath the smoothness, a blade showing through the silk. "What should concern you is that by Monday morning you'll be escorted from this building. Your employment will be terminated for gross misconduct. I'll make sure your next employer, assuming you find one, knows exactly why." Margaret stood up. The chair she hadn't sat in remained empty. "Or," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything once, "you could just approve the plasmapheresis for Lily Graves." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a whisper of conversation from the hallway. Not the usual percussion of hospital life. Just Hargrove's breathing, shallow and controlled, and the knowledge passing between them like electricity through water. "He knows that I know." The realization crystallized in his eyes, a moment of recognition that Margaret Walsh was not some quiet nurse who could be intimidated into silence. She'd connected dots he thought he'd buried. The imaging center referrals. The families with money receiving aggressive treatment protocols. The families without, the military families, the working poor, receiving comfort care recommendations and palliative transfer orders. The kickbacks flowing through his brother-in-law's facility like a hidden river. "Get out," Hargrove said. Margaret walked to the door, her footsteps the only sound on the tile floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. The door opened onto the hallway where staff passed without looking at her, where nobody had seen this conversation, where her suspended license and falsified complaint would be documented and processed and become her permanent record. She didn't look back. The ICU waiting room felt colder than it had that morning. Margaret knew every corner of Mercy General's layout, knew where the shadows pooled, where the security cameras had blind spots, where families went to fall apart when no one was watching. She found Colonel Graves in the third alcove, the one with the uncomfortable plastic chairs and a view of the city beyond the window. He looked like he hadn't slept. His uniform was immaculate, dress blues, creased sharp enough to draw blood, but underneath it he was hollowed out, running on fumes and the thin hope that medical science still had answers. Lily's chart was in her hands. Margaret had pulled it from the ICU station, reading the orders that had been entered 12 minutes ago. New physician's orders. Signed by Dr. Hargrove. Effective immediately. The word swam in front of her eyes like fish in dark water, patient to be transferred to palliative care, 4th floor, pending family meeting. All active interventions to be discontinued. Focus on comfort measures. Recommend family begin end-of-life planning discussions. 72 hours. That's all Lily had. Plasmapheresis worked in a narrow window, removed the antibodies attacking the brain, suppressed the autoimmune cascade, by time for neural recovery. After 72 hours, the damage became too extensive. After transfer to palliative care, insurance wouldn't cover it. Protocol wouldn't allow it. Hargrove had built a cage with nothing but time and policy and the weight of his authority. She stood in front of Colonel Graves. He looked up, recognition flickering across his face, not of who she was, but of something in her bearing that made him sit straighter. "Sir," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about your daughter's treatment options." The supervisor appeared before she could continue. Brenda Mueller, a woman Margaret had worked with for 3 years, a woman who'd left the break room when Margaret sat down crying after the morning rounds. Brenda's eyes wouldn't meet hers. "Margaret, you're being reassigned effective immediately," she said, her tone professional and practiced, the voice of someone reading from a script. "Post-surgical recovery, 4th floor. Gather your things. Now." Margaret's composure didn't crack. Her face remained a mask, smooth and unreactive as polished stone. But something inside her, something that had been holding steady for 3 years, for 2 decades, for a lifetime of carrying other people's weight, shifted. A single tear escaped her eye. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it fall, watching it track down her cheek like a traitor marking the moment everything changed. Then her hand moved, and the tear was gone, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped even lower, carrying the weight of command. "I'm Lily's primary nurse. Continuity of care is a fundamental principle. That child needs is no longer your concern," Brenda said. Her jaw was tight. She wasn't meeting Margaret's eyes. "4th floor. Now. Or security will assist you." The word hung in the air. Security. The escort that would carry cardboard boxes and the message that Margaret Walsh, whatever she was, whoever she'd been, had finally been removed from the picture. Colonel Graves stood up, his uniform suddenly looking like a costume, a title that meant nothing in this place. "What's happening?" His voice cracked on the question. "Where are you going? Who's taking care of?" Margaret was already moving, already being guided toward the exit by Brenda's hand on her elbow, light but immovable. She looked back over her shoulder, watching the ICU entrance as another nurse, Jessica Chen, the one who'd stood up when Margaret sat down, who'd gathered her lunch and walked away without a word, took the chart from the station. Jessica's movements were competent but mechanical, the work of someone following orders without understanding them. The hallway seemed longer than usual. The fluorescent lights cast shadows that felt like prison bars, and Margaret's reflection in the window showed a woman she barely recognized, still composed, still controlled, but unmade. 8 years old. That was Lily's age. 8 years old, and somewhere in the machinery of protocol and kickback schemes and the weight of Hargrove's network of favors, that child was being scheduled to die. The elevator doors opened. A security guard Margaret recognized, Jackson, who'd worked nights for 6 months, nodded at Brenda and looked away from Margaret's face. That was the thing about systems crushing people, nobody wanted to see it happening. Nobody wanted to witness the moment someone lost everything because they'd asked the wrong questions in the wrong place. She had maybe 48 hours before the paperwork made it official. 48 hours before her suspension was filed. 48 hours before Hargrove's investigators started calling her references, the few people in her life who knew fragments of her history and learned nothing because there was nothing official to learn. A nurse. A widow. A woman with a 12-year-old son and worn combat boots locked in her hospital locker like evidence of a life she wasn't allowed to live. What Hargrove didn't know was that Margaret had spent 20 years learning how systems worked. How power flowed. How to move through spaces where people didn't want you, how to extract information from the kind of institutional silences that most people never noticed. And in the next 48 hours, before security escorts her out for good, before the light clicked off on her career at Mercy General, she was going to find every thread of his corruption and pull them until everything he'd built came down around him. But first, she had to get through the night. She had to walk to her car in the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall, where thunder rolled across Denver like distant artillery, where nobody was watching anymore. She had to go home to her son and tell him that she'd lost her job. She had to sit at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon and explain something she couldn't find words for, and she had to do it without letting him see how completely, how utterly, the ground had fallen out from underneath them both. One step at a time. One breath at a time. The way she'd learned in places most people never went. The shift change at 11 p.m. was chaos, new nurses arriving, outgoing staff signing off, residents moving between beds like sharks sensing blood in the water. Margaret stood at the post-surgical recovery station on the 4th floor, pretending to chart, but her instincts were screaming. No updates on Lily. Nothing from the ICU. She refreshed her phone for the 10th time in as many minutes. The fluorescent light above her desk hummed like it was alive, thrumming at a frequency that matched her racing pulse. Then the code blue alarm split the air. ICU. Bay 4. Margaret didn't think. She moved. Down the corridor, taking the stairwell 2 steps at a time, her body responding before her mind could catch up, muscle memory from places she'd promised herself she'd left behind. Marjah. Phibase Shazai. A dozen field hospitals where the only difference between life and death was 30 seconds and steady hands. She burst through the ICU doors at a full sprint. Bay 4 was chaos fractured into pieces. The new night nurse stood frozen beside the monitor, hands hanging at her sides. 2 residents scrambled for equipment they didn't know how to use. And in the center of it all, Lily Graves, 8 years old, daughter of a colonel she'd helped bring into the world in a bunker under fire, her small chest moving wrong, asymmetrically, like the 2 sides of her body had forgotten how to breathe together. The monitor screamed. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 78%. 71%. The hiss of the ventilator seemed almost mocking against the chaos. Margaret pushed through. Tension pneumothorax. Left side. One of the residents turned, panic written across his face. We're waiting for the attending. She'll be dead in 90 seconds. Margaret's voice wasn't loud. It was quieter than the monitor, quieter than the ventilator, which made it terrifying. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Hand me the crash cart. The resident moved without asking. Margaret pulled a 14-gauge needle from the kit, her hands absolutely steady now, steadier than they'd been in 20 years because this wasn't a calculation anymore, it was just breathing, just the same instinct that had kept her alive when Chinooks dropped bullets like rain and compounds burned on 3 sides. She identified the landmarks on Lily's chest with her fingertips, found the space between the ribs, the precise geometry of survival. The needle went in. Immediate hiss of air escaping, not blood, not the wet sound of tissue damage, but the sharp release of pressure that meant the pneumothorax was exactly where she'd said it would be. Lily's small body gasped, color rushing back into her face like someone had turned on a light switch inside her chest. The monitor climbed. 75%. 82%. 89%. Sinus rhythm returning. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, and now it sounded like breathing again instead of screaming. Margaret stepped back from the bed, her hand still perfectly steady, and turned toward the doorway. Colonel Graves stood there with both hands over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Behind him, the hallway had gone so quiet you could hear the rain beginning outside, hammering the Denver streets like applause. Then Hargrove appeared, materializing in the doorway 30 seconds later, his face the color of old bone, his eyes moving from Lily to Margaret to the needle still in the child's chest. He saw what Margaret had done. He didn't see that she'd done it 300 times before. He didn't see the 20 years of field hospitals written in the architecture of her spine. He only saw the liability. The threat. The nurse who'd violated her scope of practice, who'd overstepped, who'd saved a life but broken every protocol doing it. His jaw clenched. Margaret watched it happen, the moment he decided what came next. Within 1 hour, hospital security was in the ICU. Margaret's locker was being cleared. The supervisor, a woman named Deborah who'd never once asked about the scars on Margaret's hands, handed her a termination letter with a kind of gentleness that made it hurt worse than if she'd screamed. Effective immediately. Performing procedures outside nursing scope of practice. Insubordination. Unauthorized presence in a unit from which you'd been reassigned. The words were precise and surgical, every one of them a knife. Margaret's personal items went into a cardboard box. Her extra scrubs, folded now in duplicate at home. Her water bottle, dented from 3 years of being tossed into her bag. Her lunch container. A photograph of her son at his last school recital, taped to the inside of her locker door, now trapped in cardboard. But the boots, her worn combat boots from Marjah, the pair she'd cleaned the dust from 20 years ago and never quite managed to wear out, those she'd left in her locker that morning, not thinking she wouldn't be coming back, not imagining that everything could come undone in the time it took to save one child's life. The box felt impossibly light in her hands. Nurses who'd worked beside her for 3 years found urgent reasons to be elsewhere as security escorted her through the unit. One of them, Sarah, who'd borrowed money from Margaret for her daughter's surgery, deliberately looked away. Colonel Graves tried to follow her into the hallway, his voice sharp with command. "She saved my daughter." Hargrove put a hand on his shoulder, and his voice was honey and arsenic. "Sir, I understand your gratitude completely, but she violated multiple protocols. We have significant liability concerns. If you'd like to file a commendation with her nursing board, the hospital would support that, but our risk management team has made their position very clear." The automatic doors slid open. Margaret walked through them into the Denver night, the cardboard box under one arm, and she didn't look back. The parking lot was nearly empty at midnight, just a few cars scattered like islands in a sea of asphalt. She got in her Honda Civic, the same one she'd owned for 6 years, practical and invisible, just like everything else about her life, and sat there for 20 minutes without turning the key. Her hands were shaking now, finally, now that nobody could see them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove had won. He'd protected his scheme. He'd silenced the one person who understood the difference between aggressive treatment and murder by comfort care. He'd removed her from the board, eliminated the threat, and done it all by the book, all within the rules, all perfectly legal and institutional and clean. And Lily, despite everything, was alive. The plasmapheresis would probably work. The child would probably survive. But how many others wouldn't? How many other Lily Graves would arrive at Mercy General while Hargrove funneled wealthy families toward experimental treatment and military families toward palliative care, toward death disguised as comfort, toward his brother-in-law's imaging center and kickbacks and corruption so smooth it had institutional blessing? For days later, Margaret sat at her kitchen table in pajamas, the termination letter in front of her, the rain from the previous night having frozen into ice that still hadn't melted. She hadn't showered. She hadn't done laundry. She'd called the nursing agency that morning to let them know she was being terminated for cause and wouldn't be available for future placement. The woman on the phone had been sympathetic, professional, completely unhelpful. When you lost a job like this, you didn't just lose income. You lost your license, usually followed, if Hargrove pressed it. You lost your identity. You lost everything except the pieces you'd buried so deep that even you couldn't find them sometimes. Her 12-year-old son, Marcus, came home from school around 3 p.m. He dropped his backpack by the door with the careless thud of someone who'd had a normal day, someone who still believed the world was stable. He looked at her sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, at the unopened mail piling in the corner, at her face. "Mom? Why aren't you at work?" She couldn't find the words. He saw her face, saw the tears she wasn't hiding anymore, and something broke in his expression, the understanding that something was genuinely wrong, not just a bad day, not just a sick shift, but real, adult wrong. She'd walked away from the Navy to give him stability. She'd cut herself in half to become invisible, to hide 20 years of decorated service, to heal from PTSD in the anonymity of night shifts and careful distance. And now she'd lost it all again. Her phone buzzed an hour later. "Sarah Chen, the nurse who'd looked away, your boots are still in your locker. Thought you'd want them. I'll leave them at security desk." So Margaret drove to Mercy General in the late afternoon, parked in visitor parking like she was a stranger, like she'd never worked there at all. She entered through the main entrance, and the fluorescent lights were the same hum, the antiseptic smell was identical, but everything about her relationship to this place had shifted. She walked toward security, moving through corridors that should have been familiar but felt like walking through a museum of someone else's life. That's when she heard the shouting. Harsh, panic Pashto cutting through the ICU corridor. Margaret froze. She moved toward the sound without thinking, purely on instinct, and there in Bay 7 was a new patient, middle-aged, severe limp, surrounded by staff and two men in suits who looked like diplomatic security. The patient was pointing at Margaret through the open doorway, backing against the bed rail, his face the color of someone who'd just seen a ghost walk in wearing scrubs. Shahzai. Shahzai. The word cut through the corridor like a bullet through glass. The ICU went silent. Every nurse turned. Every resident froze. The monitors kept beeping, indifferent to the shift in atmospheric pressure, to the way the room had suddenly become something else entirely. One of the diplomatic security translators stepped forward, face pale. He's saying he recognizes her. From Afghanistan. It's a battlefield name. Shahzai. He knows her from there. Colonel Graves stepped out of Lily's room, drawn by the commotion. He looked at Margaret directly for the first time since she'd saved his daughter, and his eyes moved from her face to her hands, the scars, the calluses, the way she stood like someone who'd spent 20 years carrying weight. His voice broke across the syllables like fracturing ice, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Margaret's hand started to tremble. Not from fear. From the way everything was collapsing at once, the careful architecture of anonymity coming down like a building hit by artillery fire. A Navy SEAL in visitor scrubs turned at the rank. He was smaller than the propaganda suggested, maybe 5'8", but he moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, and when his eyes locked on Margaret, something fundamental changed in his expression. He came to full attention, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority. Silver Star for holding a field hospital against enemy assault. Another voice, one of the residents who'd watched her save Lily. Wait, what? The SEAL continued, louder now, more staff gathering in the hallway, the former patient still pointing, still whispering Shahzai like a prayer or a curse, Bronze Star with Valor for extracting wounded under fire. 3 Purple Hearts. Colonel Graves stepped closer to Margaret, his voice barely a whisper. Marjah. 20 years ago. Emergency medevac. My wife in labor. Compound under attack. His eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with his daughter's current condition. You delivered my daughter in a bunker while mortars hit the building. Margaret pulled Lily's updated chart from the nurse's station with shaking hands. Her termination hadn't revoked her electronic access yet, hadn't had time to cascade through the system. She scrolled to the orders section. Plasmapheresis initiated 2 days ago. Multiple treatments completed. Neurological function improving. Serum biomarkers normalizing. The child was going to be fine. Margaret had been right about everything. A Marine lieutenant colonel in the corridor, visiting staff from Walter Reed, stepped forward quietly. Senior Chief Walsh held compound Shahzai for 6 hours alone after her unit evacuated wounded. She was declared KIA twice. Twice they told her family she was dead. The FBI liaison assigned to the former Taliban patient appeared in the hallway. We need to debrief this recognition immediately, Senior Chief. This patient claims to have encountered you during Operation Enduring Freedom, and if that's confirmed, we have jurisdictional questions about his current status. Hargrove appeared from his office doorway, face draining of color like someone was pulling out a plug. He looked at the SEAL, at the Marine, at Colonel Graves, at the FBI liaison, at Margaret standing in the center of the hallway with her termination letter still in her locker upstairs and 20 years of invisible service suddenly casting a shadow so long it reached across the entire ICU. The SEAL turned to him directly. This nurse has more combat decorations than your entire medical staff combined, Doctor. Hargrove tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth opened and closed like he was drowning in air. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. For days later, a patient arrived at Mercy General's ICU with paperwork stamped in 3 languages and a diplomatic medical visa that meant nobody asked too many questions. Experimental treatment for a condition that didn't officially exist. The hospital's compliance officer had approved it without reading past the first page. Nobody ever read past the first page anymore. Margaret was retrieving her boots from her locker, the worn pair with sand still embedded in the laces from Marjah, the only physical proof she'd ever been anywhere but Denver, when she heard the commotion from the patient care area. A man's voice, shouting in Pashto. The words came fast, staccato, like rifle fire. She knew that language the way some people know their mother's voice. She knew those words specifically. Shahzai. 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 The boots fell from her hands. Margaret turned slowly. The former Taliban commander stood in the hallway, his frame rigid, his eyes locked on her locker with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost. His face had gone the color of old bone. When his gaze found hers, his hand started shaking. He pointed at her with a trembling finger, repeating the name again and again like a prayer or a curse. Shahzai. The name Afghan fighters had given her after 6 hours holding a compound alone while her unit was pinned down 3 kilometers out. The name whispered in bazaars. The name mothers told their children at night to keep them inside after dark. The name she'd buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it belonged to her. Nurses scattered. The floor erupted into the kind of chaos that happens when a patient recognizes something primal in another human being, not the recognition of a face, but the recognition of a weapon. The man kept pointing. His mouth moved. His voice cracked on the vowels. Colonel Graves appeared in the hallway 30 seconds later, his uniform still creased from morning briefing, his eyes moving from the commotion to Margaret and then to the file in his hands. His breathing changed. His jaw tightened. He stepped toward her slowly, the way you approach something that might bolt, and when he spoke, his voice broke on the first word. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Those 4 words contained everything. The recognition. The knowledge. The understanding that the woman in scrubs who'd been fired 4 days ago for saving his daughter's life was not who the hospital thought she was. Had never been who they thought she was. Margaret didn't look away from the file in his hands. She could read the vital signs from 10 feet away. The numbers didn't lie. Lily's oxygen saturation steady at 98%. Her intracranial pressure normalized. The plasmapheresis Margaret had recommended, the treatment Hargrove had denied, was working. She's improving, Margaret said. Her voice sounded like it came from underwater. Yes. Colonel Graves' eyes glistened. Because you wouldn't stop fighting for her. A Navy SEAL commander who'd been visiting another patient in the ICU, a helicopter crash survivor 2 rooms down, heard the commotion and came to investigate. He took one look at Margaret standing there in scrubs with her boots in her hands, and his spine straightened like a compass finding north. He'd served with people like her. He recognized the stance, the composure, the way she occupied space as if she'd learned how to do it in places most people would break. He stood at attention. The gesture was pure reflex, muscle memory older than civility. Silver Star. His voice carried across the corridor. Other staff stopped moving. Bronze Star with Valor. 3 Purple Hearts. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one hung in the air like smoke. And a Navy Cross. He said it quieter, almost reverent. The hallway went so still you could hear the ventilators humming in the patient rooms, that rhythmic breathing of machines keeping people tethered to the living world. A nurse, not Sarah Chen, someone newer, was staring at Margaret with her mouth open like she'd just realized she'd been taking orders from a decorated veteran for 3 years while thinking she was taking orders from nobody. Within the hour, hospital security escorted Dr. Hargrove from his office with his hands shaking so badly he could barely carry the cardboard box they handed him. The CEO of Mercy General had arrived from his office downtown the moment he heard, a former Army colonel himself, the kind of man who'd learned in briefing rooms that you don't fire combat veterans for saving children. He'd pulled Hargrove into a conference room with Margaret present, along with the chief of medicine and a woman from HR who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Someone explain why a decorated combat veteran was terminated for saving a child's life. The CEO's voice had the weight of command authority, the kind that doesn't need to raise volume because the entire room is already listening. Hargrove had tried his practiced explanation, the words that had worked on hospital boards and insurance companies for years. She performed a procedure outside her scope, violated chain of command. The CEO cut him off like turning off a radio. She performed a needle decompression. The same procedure she's performed how many times, Senior Chief? 317, sir. Margaret's voice was steady, measured, the voice of someone reporting facts to a superior officer. In field condition significantly worse than an ICU. The CEO turned back to Hargrove. And the plasmapheresis you denied for the Graves child, the treatment that's currently working, why was that rejected? Hargrove's face had started to show something Margaret recognized from years of watching men break under pressure. The flush at the neck. The slight tremor in the hands. The look of someone realizing their walls were caving in all at once. Clinical judgment, he'd said, but the words had no air in them. Experimental nature. It's a standard treatment for autoimmune encephalitis. Covered by insurance. The CEO slid a folder across the table like he was dealing cards in a game Hargrove had already lost. We've been auditing your referral patterns, Dr. Hargrove. Interesting how many wealthy patients get referred to your brother-in-law's imaging center. Interesting how many military families get comfort care recommendations instead of standard treatments. The silence that followed tasted like copper. Hargrove had tried to stand, to leave, to do something to regain control of the narrative. His chair scraped back so hard it nearly toppled. I want my attorney. You'll need one, the CEO had said calmly. The same security guard who'd handed Margaret her cardboard box 4 days ago appeared at the conference room door with an identical box. He looked at Hargrove with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching justice move slower than it should but inevitably. When he spoke, his voice was flat and professional, but underneath it was a smile. I believe you know the way out, Doctor. Hargrove's hands shook as he took the box. He'd tried to meet Margaret's eyes as he left the room, tried to mount some kind of silent appeal, but she'd looked through him the way you look through glass. He was already gone. The institutional power that had felt so absolute 5 days ago had evaporated the moment a former Army colonel learned that a Navy officer had been fired for evidence-based medicine. 6 months later, Margaret passed a strip mall on the corner of Quincy and Morrison where a man sat at a folding table under a handmade banner, supplemental insurance, ask me how. The man was thin now, diminished, the kind of thin you get from stress that won't let you digest food properly. He wore a polo shirt with a company logo embroidered on the chest. His shoes were clean but his eyes had developed the quality of someone who'd learned the precise weight of consequences. He saw Margaret walking past in her Mercy General scrubs, her ID badge visible, the worn combat boots visible now because she wasn't hiding anything anymore. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. She kept walking. That evening, in her apartment, Margaret's 12-year-old son found her cleaning out an old box of things she'd kept buried in the back of her closet. Inside were the medals, the photographs, the discharge papers, the letters from Colonel Graves, written over 20 years, updates about a girl who was now a woman studying engineering at the University of Colorado. Are those real? Her son asked, pointing at the silver star. Yes. You never showed me these before. Margaret picked up one of the photographs, herself, 30 years old, standing in front of a compound wall in Marjah, a uniform darkened with dust and blood that wasn't hers. I was trying to forget I'd ever been that person. Were you a soldier or a nurse? He asked. She thought about Lily's drawing, a crayon nurse with wings and a stethoscope, now taped inside her locker next to her senior chief insignia. She thought about Colonel Graves visiting monthly with Lily, bringing coffee, never staying long but always shaking her hand with both of his. She thought about the former Taliban commander being transferred to a federal facility, his recognition of her becoming the thread the FBI needed to verify a battle they'd been investigating for 2 decades. Both. I'm both. Her phone buzzed. Sarah Chen's voice came through tight and focused, new admit, trauma bay. Combat veteran, IED injury, complicated presentation. I pulled your file. Thought you'd want to know. Margaret stood. She laced her boots, not hidden under her scrubs anymore, but visible, worn leather with sand still in the creases. She grabbed her keys. Her son watched her put on her white coat, watched her pin the senior chief insignia to her collar where it caught the light. "Stay home?" he asked. "I'm a nurse, honey. That's what we do." She drove to Mercy General through rain that hammered the windshield like applause. The ICU was waiting. The patient was waiting. The chance to fight with a stethoscope instead of a rifle, though some days Margaret understood there wasn't much difference between the two. In the trauma bay, they were already waiting for her. Not because of her rank, though she had one now. Not because of her medals, though she was wearing them. They were waiting because word had spread through every hospital corridor in Denver that when you had a patient with nowhere else to go, when the case was impossible, when every standard protocol had failed, you called Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Some wars you fight with rifles. Some wars you fight with stethoscopes. She'd learned to fight with both. And she'd learned that the hardest battles weren't the ones that killed you. They were the ones that taught you how to live. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.